Carlos's role is still the beginning of jiu-jitsu. You know, regardless of who taught him, he was the inceptor. Has your opinion or placement of Elio in the lineage changed at all as a result of the research that you'd be willing to talk about and not spoil anything for the book?
I think Carlos, you know, he kickstarted. He gets the ball rolling. Carlos was an outstanding manager. Like, I don't think he was a good coach person. I don't think he knew that much jiu-jitsu, if you want to be frank. He definitely wasn't a good fighter. I think that what he did was he got his brothers to fight. I'm like, you're gonna fight, we're gonna train, and we're gonna win. And he was an outstanding manager. He was like Dana White of, like, he was that kind of guy. Like, I'm gonna make it happen. We're gonna do it. Like, he was a very ambitious guy. What he did was he trained his brother George, you know, who initially was the first hero of the Gracie's family. He was a very, very underplayed character in this whole story as well. For the same reasons Joe Mori got forgotten. If you have a fallout with Carlos and Helio, then you're eliminated from the story, and they were eliminated from the story
because they controlled the narrative. They were the ones controlling everything.
They were very shrewd and, you know, getting the press on their side. They had their enemies too, but like they put it like this: if they were today, they would have 5 million Twitter followers. Right. Like, they knew how to play the game. They played it well. But he was the one who really continues Carlos' story, because it becomes very clear as Carlos gets older. And Carlos was almost like a father to Helio. Their relationship is described as a father-son relationship, given the age discrepancy. But you know, Helio is the one who really continues what Carlos started. So when people want to say that Helio was the godfather of his jiu-jitsu, I think that's unfair. I wouldn't put it that way, but he definitely did more for jiu-jitsu than Carlos. He definitely did more.
Let me ask you one more question about the Maeda Kano judo jiu-jitsu kind of discussion, because throughout the course, and we'll get back to the Gracies. I got a bunch of stuff about the Gracies too. When you talk about the relevance of judo in Japan, you know, you could talk about Kano taking jiu-jitsu, which was this kind of like fractured art, and turning into something during the cultural revolution of Japan to become more westernized. It was more palatable. That was less dangerous, more of a sport type activity that still incorporated the ideas of cultural martial arts in Japan and tried to spread them out. And then, you know, obviously Medea trained at the Kodokan, Giottomi trained at the Kodokan. All these guys that are the names of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu trained at the Kodokan, but Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil is no longer called judo, it's called Jiu-Jitsu. I heard a couple references about falling out with Kano because, according to the Kodokan and Kano's rules, you're not allowed to be a professional fighter because it's unethical in his eyes. It doesn't follow the code, the Bushido code. Tell us about some of the things, because in that same chain of thought, there's, like you said, there's tons of judo academies in Brazil at the time, and you know, the Gracies and a few others with holds out, stuck strong to the jiu-jitsu name, right? Broke away from the Kodokan. Tell us about how that particular thing started, how we see the idea of jiu-jitsu as something separate from judo in those early days, and why it came to that.
It's, well, the term jiu-jitsu is a generic term. The term, we call it jiu-jitsu, but it really, what we do is not jiu-jitsu. What we do is the Brazilian version of judo, which is just that's all it is. Just Brazilians got really good at it, and they helped spread it around the world, and that's a whole separate story.
You said a few things that I thought was interesting. The idea of one of the rationales you thought that the reason why Nawaza became more important than Takawaza is because of space. Because in Brazil, the gyms are, you know, you had this much room, so tossing people around just isn't right. So we just did it on the ground because that's what we could do.
I think that's it's speculation, but I think it's an informed one, because it's rare in Brazil that you find jiu-jitsu mats that are, you know, big enough for standing. Most of them are too tight. But you know, the term is generic. So jiu-jitsu is a generic term. Judo is a form of jiu-jitsu, the pre-Meiji sense of the word, right? Jiu-jitsu, not jiu-jitsu like we call it, right? We westernize the kanjis. And it was, you know, in the West, when it first started blowing up, the terms were used interchangeably, and judo was the less common terminology. Jiu-jitsu was more common. So when the first wave of Japanese come to the West, they're using the term jiu-jitsu. So the name really catches on in the West. The first way these guys use to make money is the circus, is professional fights, fake fights. So jiu-jitsu quickly becomes associated with fake fighting and professional fighting. Jigoro Kano does not like this. He changes the name to dissociate his school, which had a completely different philosophy from that, right? And he wants to make a distinction. Now, the next wave of Japanese that start traveling the world out of the Kodokan, they start using the term judo, because later the term judo becomes more popular amongst Japanese immigrants because it was somewhat of a modern term. The first wave of Japanese used jiu-jitsu. Sada Miyako used jiu-jitsu. Mitsui Maeda used jiu-jitsu. He did use judo on occasion, but normally he used jiu-jitsu.
So it was more just a timing type thing. The name judo hadn't really become synonymous with what their practice has become yet until later on.
Let's say this story had started in 1940. No one would be using the term jiu-jitsu. It just because it started when Maeda leaves 1904, the common term, not just Maeda, but other Japanese, that first wave of immigrants, the common term in Japan was jiu-jitsu. So they just go on with it, right? And in Brazil, it really caught on because the circus really had an important role in all of this. Like professional fighting, fake fighting had a huge relevance to this whole story. And the term of jiu-jitsu kept associated with the circus and these professional fights. As traditional judokas moved away from the circus, they stuck more and more to the term judo. And the Brazilians who stuck to the professional fighting scene just kept on with the term jiu-jitsu. And that's where we come from, right? Because our background it stopped being Kodokan after a while, and it becomes a circus. It becomes professional fighting. That's how these guys were making a living. That's how George Gracie, Gio Amori made a living. That's how, Helio, his fights were all professional fights. They were not, judo tournaments. And he made his name in a professional fight scene.
Yeah, it's important to kind of take a moment and think about that too, and the fact of part of the reasons why I feel like jiu-jitsu has evolved into the dominant martial art that what it is, because when you think about judo and jiu-jitsu, and we can debate this till all end, like the idea of jiu-jitsu is still based upon a martial art. We're still fighting with each other. And I think part of the reason why that happened is because in Japan, things were moving towards more of a ceremonial purpose, because when the samurais used their jiu-jitsu, it was to the death. There was these ideas if we had confrontations to fight to see who was the better, but you killed the guy when you lost. There was no, hey, you're good job, great work, you died. So the idea of fighting professionally became distasteful to the Bushido code because they're a very honorable culture in Japan. So what you see is the more fixed fights, professional fights, things that started to take on professional wrestling that I believe would be some kind of an offshoot of what jiu-jitsu was or the samurais. But then when you take a culture like Brazil, you talked a lot about how Brazilian culture, they're fighters. That's what they do. Like when they interviewed Robson Gracie, or Robson Gracie, Hobson. I said it right. Hobson, right. Which was one of my favorite interviews of the whole book. It was just interesting to see. Like if you want to talk about like the quintessential Gracie, it's Hobson. He's polished. He's got it down. He knows what he's doing.
I will say though, it's hard to pick a favorite, but I do love that when you were interviewing Chris Howder, the way you wrote his word, it's like the way he talks, and it was very. Chris, it was
so the point I'm trying to make is that when you interviewed Hobson, he was talking to Hobson. He was talking about how it was like an honor when you were on the street, men come up to challenge you, and that's what you did. You told the girlfriends to stand aside, and that was part of the culture of what was in Brazil. So now you have this martial art that comes to the States that is tried and tested. You got guys like Helio. They're like, hey, we're going to show you who the best is because I'm going to kick your ass. We're going to go fight. Part of that cultural divide is the reason why judo has become an Olympic sport, which, you can say it's merits for self, but nothing's useless. But jiu-jitsu is real. There's a real fighting element to it.
And this is the true contribution of the Gracie family, because I know some people are like, oh, clearly you're attacking the call of the Gracie family.
No, just real quick before I don't interrupt you again, but reading the book, I'm going to get into it. At no point did I ever believe in any way, shape, or form that you were taking away from the contributions the Gracie family had. You were just telling the correct story upon that.
And men like Carlos and Helio and Carlson and Holes, and they're super important, but just for very different reasons. But what they did do, and this, you got to give them a lot of credit for this, because it's a truly incredible story. In fact, I think it's more incredible than what they made it sound. I walked away from this with an admiration, not for their methods, but for their ambition. And I admire ambition. That's why the opening quote of like the film is that Edmund the Bastard speech. It's a speech about ambition. We were born in a lower place, but we will rise above. We're not base. We will grow. We're gonna conquer. It doesn't matter where we were born, who we are. We're not Japanese. It doesn't matter. We're gonna carve a story out of this, and they did carve a story out of it. And they were doing it at a time where no one cared. No one cared to learn. It was niche. It was them, their cousins, some friends. People in Rio de Janeiro didn't know what jiu-jitsu was. Pedro Pano told me this. In the 90s, when he was a kid, he had never heard of jiu-jitsu. And he was from Rio de Janeiro, just to give an idea of how niche this was. But
yeah, that's something as Americans, like we have this preconceived notion that like in Brazil, like every kid in every street corner when you're born,
they're thrown in a
gi
gi
like
before you can even
you
walk. You're thrown to the wolves.
They're telling you how to do an omoplata. You know,
I heard of jiu-jitsu for the very first time in my life after Royce Gracie. And it was the same for Pedro Pano, who's from Rio. I'm from São Paulo. He's from Rio, and he had never heard of it. Right. So just to give an idea of like what, and they did keep a martial aspect of judo alive because as it becomes Olympic, they're worried about public perception. They need government support. They need the Ministry of Education to support them. They need the Olympic Committee to support them. The private sector's got to sponsor these athletes. They're worried about their public perception. So if we sponsor an athlete who fights now, that becomes a problem, right? So judo has this for better or for worse, but they have this concern with public perception. Whereas these guys in Brazil, they don't have that concern because they're not an Olympic sport. Like we're going to keep the martial side alive. In fact, the martial aspect of it, the combat aspect of it, was the only means available to them to keep this alive, and they did. And they brought it back in '93, and that's incredible because it was this. I mean, we're talking a 4-decade span of nothing happening in Brazil. Like nothing was happening. Like they had their big moment in '51 against Kimura, which the president was watching. It was a big moment for jiu-jitsu. Up to the Royce Gracie, that was their biggest moment. And then 4 decades of silence. Yeah, they have some vale-tudo fights here and there. They had, every now and then they'd be on the press, but it wasn't anything major. It was very niche. But they stuck to it when most people would have given up. Most people would have been absorbed by judo. They stuck to their vision. And that's truly remarkable. And it's almost like they created a little culture within the own family. This own little Spartan culture that's not Brazilian. It's not Brazilian. That's them. That's the Gracie family. That's not Brazilian in any way. We have this little Spartan culture, and we're going to eat this way. We're going to train jiu-jitsu. Everyone's going to train. Everyone's going to fight. And if we're going to have to scrap in the streets, it's going to be, 1 versus 1. And they had this code of honor in their way of fighting. If there was more than one of them, we would call our brothers. Like Hobson said, we're going to call our brothers. They would call, and we'd come over and we'd fight, and no one would interfere. Wonderful, beautiful thing. Like,
so
how nostalgic he is about it, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that for a while it seemed that, and this isn't really something you get into a whole lot, but there was a brief time when Capoeira and BJJ were sort of like in a rivalry to see what their national method of self-defense, their cultural method of self-defense would be. Do you think that Capoeira is lacking of a family, of a standard bearer like the Gracies is why Jiu-Jitsu sort of, yeah?
I think it's, without the Gracie family, we'd all be doing judo. And when I say Gracie family, I mean specific members. I think some members of the Gracie family did more harm than good. I'm not going to mention names, but some of them did way more harm to jiu-jitsu than good, in my opinion. But some
after we're not live,
and we would all be doing judo. There's no doubt about that. I think that catch wrestling did everything we do before we did. They were ahead of judo, if you ask me. In technical terms, these guys were doing heel hooks. I mean, they were good fighters, but they never had a federation. They never had a Kodokan. That's why they didn't blow up. They didn't have a Gracie family. That's why they didn't blow up. Like judo had its Kodokan. That's how they grew. They had this nucleus, right? They kept the whole thing cohesive, and they grew like a beehive, very Japanese style. And in Brazil, they had it was more chaotic, less organized, but, to the test, like, you're going to have to prove it. You know how to fight? All right, let's fight. When Pedro Meterio got mad at Helio for saying that João Alberto Barreto was the 3rd best fighter in Brazil, Helio first, Carlson 2nd, João Alberto Barreto, Pedro Meterio. Pedro Meterio was furious. Like, how I'm your oldest student. I was here first. How can you name him number 3? Oh, really? Fight. You two. Let's find out who number 3 is. Pedro Meterio didn't want that. So there's this element in jiu-jitsu that Brazilians kept alive. They go, oh, really? You're that good? Okay, put it to the test. Let's find out. I don't.
That's all. I think.
Yeah, I don't care how many stripes you got on your belt. You're number 3? Okay, put it to the test. Let's find out. And that was preserved, and that's what kept this whole thing real. That's why the UFC is as real as it gets. because they get that. Vale Tudo is not a product of the Gracie family per se, but they were important in keeping this tradition alive, right? Because that's how they paid their bills for a long time. It was just like, Carlston Gracie used to joke that if it weren't for me, the Gracie family would be selling bananas in some square in Brazil, which is probably true. Like he kept the decades of silence, he was the guy who was keeping their name relevant.
Well, I mean, the Gracies were pretty well off before jiu-jitsu, wasn't their father a trader of some kind? I know he came from Scotland, right?
Yeah, they had their moments in the 19th century. Like they seem to come from money, but if things go astray for them, they were actually struggling. And Joseto Ficairos in his PhD dissertation talks. That's what his PhD dissertation is about, by the way. If you haven't read it, you guys should. It's great. But it talks about, like, there's the term that he uses is Gracie patrician ethos, and I just love those words because I think that is the key ingredient. That speaks back to that ambition I was telling you guys about. Of we're going to make it happen no matter what. We are scions from the 19th century. We belong in a higher place. We're not just like everyone else. We are better. We are different, even though they were broke. But they still had that ethic of we are, or that the patrician ethos of being, superior to other people. And Joseto Ficairos talks a lot about this, and it's a very valid point because I think it was a key ingredient to having Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu be possible was that ambition, that belonging, the sense of belonging that they had of being in a higher place in society. And it's very, very present throughout the story. But for most of their story, they were dependent. I mean, Oscar Santamaria is someone no one's ever heard of. He was not a fighter. He was not. I learned recently. He actually did teach some classes, but he was not that. That's not why he's important. He was important because he was the Jiu-Jitsu's bank. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu had a bank. It was called Oscar Santamaria, and for a long time, he was the one, that made living possible, so this thing could continue and survive and have some breathing room long enough to blow up in '93. But he was very important in the sense of he became like a financier for the Gracie family.
Wasn't he also somewhat of the spiritual advisor to Carlos Sr.? Wasn't he part of the one that kind of brought in some of the occult aspects that the Gracies are kind of famous for?
No, it was, that's what Halo says. In Halo's biography, Oscar Santamaria gets Carlos into the spiritualism and the mystique of the Rosicrucian world. I think most people would agree it's the other way around. He might have been interested, but Carlos was the leader. It's very clear that Carlos, and I don't say this, I hope no one takes this as an insult to Carlos, but if you read Halo's biography and you're able to read in between the lines, she says it out in the open. Carlos was manipulating this guy. There's no doubt that Carlos took advantage of how naive this guy was and how wealthy he was at the same time. So there's no doubt. You read her biography, you read it between the lines, you see it.
Rob, I need you to tell us both and all of our listeners right now, are we, by doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, engaging in demon worship? Just yes or no, all right? Because I don't know if I'll stop if the answer is yes, okay?
I don't know about demon worship. Carlos, he had a very, I think he knew how to tap into people's. He was that kind of guy. Obviously, I never met him, but he strikes me as the kind of man who would look you in the eye and tell you what you want to hear and convince you just about anything. And Oscar Santamaria was in his pocket for decades, man. This went on forever. I guess it's towards the end of his life. That's when he snaps out of it, right? His sister helps him. Hey, listen, this guy's been conning you for years, right? That's, long story short, that's what was happening. But and this is not me. Every historian, if this is one of the things that everyone agrees on, historians don't agree on anything, but this one everyone agrees on. It's pretty obvious that Carlos is, manipulating Oscar Santamaria to his own benefit.
Yeah, I think a lot when I think about the impact that the Gracie family had on the influence of jiu-jitsu and the spread of jiu-jitsu is they were the family that we're not going to judo. This is what we do. We're going to be the rebels. We're going to stand out. We're going to continue to post these events. We're going to continue to do everything we can do to have fights. We'll have Gracie challenges. We'll have any kind of gym stormings we can do to continue to promote the name of the Gracie family because we've carved our little niche out into the public. And one of the biggest quotes that you kept bringing back up in the book is when, again, another one from Hobson, when you asked him about the influence of Maeda, and he said, well, yes, people always talk about Maeda, but without Helio, without Carlos, no one would know who Maeda was. So, yes, was there some instances where maybe Carlos and Helio maybe learned a little on their own, maybe it took a little bit from here, a little bit from there, and kind of developed their own system based upon that, and then spouted the lineage? Sure, but like without any of that, like you said, we'd all be doing judo. There'd be nothing left.
100%. 100%. And, Maeda, it's ironic, but Maeda, even though every Brazilian who wanted to be popular in jiu-jitsu was borrowing his name, right? They're using his name to promote themselves. But it was because of that he's remembered. If it were not for, Carlos Gracie especially, if it were not for Carlos, no one would know who Maeda was. I mean, in the Kodokan, there's a picture of Maeda on the wall. It's at the Kodokan Museum, meaning they acknowledge that piece of their history. Was that unique in their history? No. There were thousands of Japanese from the Kodokan who traveled the world. Why Maeda? Why is Maeda remembered? Maeda is remembered because of Carlos Gracie. Yeah. And that's the point I make. It's Carlos that makes Maeda, not the other way around. Maeda would have been a footnote in history had it not been for Carlos Gracie and his marketing efforts.